Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 9 of the semester. I'm Professor Rios. Hope you're doing well. This week, it is the fascinating region known as Eurasia slash the Russian domain, however you want to address it. So it's interesting in that it is really, really big. It is connected to many other regions. It has in its southern flank the newest region, which the book has identified as Central Asia. It is connected to China inextricably. China is now a big component of everything we talk about from now on. And of course, there are ties to Europe along its western flank. So, having said all of that, let's get going with the Google Earth tour. So, Russia is, as you already know, really, really big. It, as you will see in a later slide in the presentation, it encompasses 11 time zones. It is dominated by Russian influence, although the further east you go, the more native, what we would call Native Americans or Eskimo or any of that sort of background you tend to find here. So they look more Asian, excuse me, than they look Russian. So that becomes a bigger and bigger deal. Uh, the region extends basically from the US Russia border, which does exist right here. This is Russia, this is the United States. The Diomede Islands, Little Diomede, Big Diomede. And here begins the very eastern portion of Siberia. Now, back in colder times, this is all land. So that's the so-called land bridge or the Bering Strait Bridge that made possible the movement of people long time ago from what we call Asia into the North American continent. If you look at Russia from its northern shore with the Arctic, so most of this is usually frozen during winter, all the way up to the Finnish border, including some of the more interesting places on Earth, like the island called Novaya Zemlya. This is where the biggest nuclear explosion ever took place back in the 1950s, as the Cold War was sort of gearing up. So it's a hydrogen bomb. It is the biggest explosion ever to take place on Earth because of human activity. Now, if you look at it from the climate perspective, the shoreline is tundra, so there are no trees. And then suddenly, as you head further south, you run into what is called either the taiga, the boreal forest, the snow forest. It is the biggest collection of pine trees on Earth. Deep climate, severe climate, basically the climate you would find in Canada or the extreme northern United States, like Maine, Vermont, that area of the country. You have mountains that run north south, the Caucasus, and these mountains run all the way down towards present day Kazakhstan. As you head west, you have basically Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. They're now independent states. So that's sort of the bridge or the fence, if you want to call it that, between Europe and Russia. Even Finland, which is often lumped in with Sweden, Norway, and Iceland as Scandinavian, Finland has more in common with Russia than it does with its Swedish and Nordic neighbors. So, still Nordic, still Scandinavian from a regional perspective, but significant parts of it are basically quite Russian in origin. So that's the layout. It's a very interesting region as a function of its continentality. There are really no warm oceans anywhere near Russia. Even here in the Sea of Okhotsk, um, or the Bering Sea. I mean, these are often frozen during winter, so they're not particularly useful. They're definitely not warm water ports. You have to go way south into Japan and Korea in order to find that. And then, of course, you have the ongoing tensions between Russia and Europe. And we'll get into that in the presentation. So that is your Google Earth mini tour. I highly encourage you to look at it on your own using Google Chrome. It is definitely worth your while. All right, so here's a presentation itself. Again, I either Russian domain, Eurasia. This is a picture of Moscow, beautiful. It's sort of the epicenter of, Russia and this whole region. Obviously, it's the biggest city. It meets the description or definition of urban primacy, meaning the city is twice as big as the next biggest city. Okay, so these are the learning objectives. And really a big part of this discussion for this region is understanding that Russia still has a lot of post-Soviet and Soviet era influence, even down to its former, now independent states, like a Ukraine or a Kazakhstan. Okay. These are some of the concepts and key terms. So setting the boundaries, of course, it's a vast region. It has rapidly changed both economically and politically. And there are new global relationships that persist, whether that be Russian influence on its former Soviet counterparts, or whether that be China, which is frankly the more significant one to current day. Again, here's a Russian domain, as mentioned earlier, 11 time zones. The mainland US only 4. Again, there's the rest of it, big enough that you had to put it in 2 slides. This shows you how on the eastern end, you have a bit more sort of tectonic and volcanic activity as a function of interaction between plates, the North American plate and the Eurasian plate, and the Pacific plate. A couple of videos that are posted and linked through your class page. One, Russia's geography problem, and the other one, the within Russian republics. Both interesting and worth your while, not particularly long, less than 10 minutes, or around 10 minutes a piece. But it gives you a different perspective about the region. And again, even though this region covers more than just Russia, Russia is the dominant player. So it's addressed more. So images of Russia, it's obviously beyond just Moscow, the big city in the middle, or to the west rather. There is vast wilderness between that and the Pacific. There are environmental issues that harken back to the Soviet era still. So the Soviet Union lasted from 1917 to 1991. And as a result of weapons building and war waging and all that, there's severe air and water pollution, heavy metals in the ground as a result of mining, and of course nuclear waste both from nuclear weapons and Chernobyl, which took place in the Ukraine back in 1986. These are again some of the environmental issues that affect the region. Of course, you have Chernobyl. You have this island, as I mentioned earlier, Novaya Zemlya, This is again where a lot of nuclear waste and pollution remains as a function of that really, really, really big weapons testing that took place. Okay. As a function of climate change and water issues, there's a lot of permafrost that's being lost because the summers are getting warmer, even if the winters are still pretty cold. And there's a lot of pollution of rivers and lakes and so on. So here is one. So this is Lake Baikal. This is a very long and very deep lake, which contains 20% of the planet's fresh water. Think about that. One lake in Russia has 20% of the entire planet's fresh water. This had been polluted significantly as a function of the tree logging industry. It has made significant strides forward, so that's a good thing. Again, the paper mill pollution in the 1950s and 60s. It was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the 1990s, and it has made significant improvements since then. So that's a good thing. It is deep inside Russia's severe winter declimate zone, so it is frozen for a good chunk of the year. Again, diverse physical landscape, as mentioned earlier. The most significant aspect of the physical landscape is the fact that Russia, along with Canada, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Canada, and Alaska, essentially contain most of the pine needle trees on Earth. Russia has the biggest percentage of that. And this is referred to as the boreal forest, taiga forest, or snow forest, however you want to address it, because it lies far enough north from the mid-latitudes but south of the tundra. So this is a declimate type of environment. And there you see it. Notice how most of it is blue, whether it be that dark blue, that middle shade, or that lighter shade of blue. It is a region that has hot summers, but really cold winters. So the difference in temperature between the high and the low can be dramatic. Like in winter, in a place like Verkhoyansk, you can have temperatures as low as -70. But in the summer, you could be as high as the 90s. So that gives you a sense of what great dramatic changes you can have. These are some of the potential changes due to climate change. Less severe winters, so that's a good thing, right? Saving on energy. Perhaps oil exploration possibilities due to less ice over the Arctic, and a longer growing season. Now, most climate change issues are bad, but there are some that are good. It really depends on where you are. It's, as it says in there, like real estate, it's location, 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 right? So let's see here. Some of the potential hazards, longer wildfire season, and this has been a problem in Yakutia, which is basically the heart of Siberia, where they've had significant forest fires. And if you go watch this video, which I really recommend you do, it is called The Great Human Odyssey, and go to the 1 hour, 1 minute point. What you will find there is a really good explanation of how the native population of Russia lives. They live pretty much as they have lived their entire lives. They're nomadic, and they move with the seasons, and they have giant herds of reindeer, like Santa Claus reindeer. And that's how they live. So they are literally living off the land in those really severe conditions that you find in that region. And when you look at the people there, they don't look Russian. They have no Slavic look to them. They do not look like Olga and Vladimir when you think of Russia. They don't look like at all like that. They are native people, and they have more of an Asian look to them, which sort of gives you a sense of how remarkably varied and diverse that region of the world actually is. Again, harsh climates limit the amount of productivity you can have. So essentially, the majority of agriculture takes place in that orange area and green area. So that's where you tend to find the majority of grain production and growth during the warm season. In the purple and blue, very little, if anything. It's just too cold. And when you look at that image there on the left in Ukraine, that could very well be Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska. It's like a prairie. So it's very, very similar to what we find in the breadbasket of the United States. Population. So let's look at some people stuff. So the population obviously is restricted to the Western quarter. As you can see, anything in this sort of color you see here is 6 to 25, up to about 200 to 500 people per square kilometer. Once you get into this area here, you're talking about fewer than 6 people. So it's a very, very, very lightly populated area, especially on the east side. So fertility rates are low, with the exception of Georgia in the region. Every other country is below 2.1. It is clearly an area of low fertility and high death rate. And the high death rate has nothing to do with health. It is mostly as a function of age. So it is a persistently declining population. So the government has input many incentive programs in order to forecast an improvement to this population crisis that they're having to deal with. Let's see here. Here's a population pyramid. So this is 1990 for Russia. There you see the World War II echo. Millions of Russians died during World War II, especially men. And as a result, you see how that has hurt the population of Russia. It has made it lopsided, more so than any other place on Earth. That population, that's how it looks like in 2020 rather. And look what happened here. This is the end of the Soviet Union. Boom. Huge decline. I mean, enormous decline. And why did that happen? Because when the Soviet Union ended, there was so much economic and political turmoil and uncertainty that people just stopped having kids or had few kids because of the economic uncertainty of the time. And that was so for 5 and 10 years. It hasn't barely recovered since then. So that's a significant, you can see that world event manifested in the population pyramid. This is Ukraine in 2020, similar population shape. Migration, whether it's Eastern movement or political motives, either as a function of Russification, the interaction between Russia and its Asian neighbors, that has made a significant impact. But if you look at it from the map, the majority of migration is migration towards Moscow, the big city, or away from the area towards Canada, the United States, and parts of Europe, like Germany and Hungary and Poland. So that gives you a sense of how the migration patterns have sort of evolved over time. Many of the people who lived in former Soviet satellites like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan have migrated back towards Russia because there are frankly more financial opportunities there for them. All right. let's see here. This is what Russia looked like back in 1300. So it would be this little area, the Principality of Russia. And that's how Russia has evolved from the 1300s through the centuries into the mid 1950s, the territory that's added. Obviously, they lost Central Asia and they lost these states when Russia became Russia again and the Soviet Union fell apart. Linguistically, obviously, the majority of people speak Russian, anything in the yellow, but as you head further east, so into what we call Siberia, it is mostly a language that is Altaic or Eskimo, meaning more native. It doesn't mean they don't speak Russian, but they rather speak their own native language. So you go more Slavic here and less so as you head east. Here's a way of looking at language from the Ukraine perspective. So Ukraine, the further west you go, the less Russian it is. The further east you go, the more Russian it is. Because of proximity to the Russian border. That makes sense, right? The Caucasus region, this is an area that contains what we call Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and that whole area there is very volatile, but it has a variety of languages that are spoken. Okay? So ethnicity matters, frankly. That's something that has to be sort of viewed as a function of how complex the patchwork is. So here's the idea of religious and ethnic diversity in the region. The big church in Russia is the Russian Eastern Orthodox Church. But then you have the minority. Notice when you look at this individual, notice how she has a more Asian look to her as opposed to Russian. Yet this woman lives in Russia and is Russian by birth and probably speaks Russian in addition to her native or more ethnic language, which is more geographically contained. And so let's look at some of the, in terms of Soviet era geopolitics, anything that is not brown or anything that's not this color used to be the Soviet Union. It was enormous. It's still big, but it lost everything in these colors, anything in this. So now, obviously, Soviet era geopolitics addresses the fact that you're talking about communism, central control, the state managing everything, which led to the whole idea of the Iron Curtain, where although a lot of those other states had some degree of autonomy, the state, meaning Moscow, meaning Russia, frankly controlled everything. This led to the whole USSR Cold War landscape. And again, many of you, in fact, if not all of you, weren't born. So your whole lives have existed in a post-Soviet Union world. But back when the Cold War was still a thing, it was a very bipolar world, meaning it was the US and its view of the world, and it was Russia or the Soviet Union and its view of the world. It was a far simpler world, quite frankly, back then than it is now, because everybody chose a side, and you were either with the US or you were with the Soviet Union. So it made things easier, maybe more complicated. It really depends on how you viewed it. These are, again, Soviet era geopolitics, the realization by the USSR that the communist system had to adapt in order to function in a more globalized world. It was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Globalization was starting to take hold, so the Soviet Union had to restructure its economy. It just fell apart, though, in 1991. So the current political framework addresses the issue of complication: Chechnya, Georgia, the Kuril Islands between Japan and Russia, the Ukraine. And speaking of the Ukraine, because places do matter, we're talking about the Crimean Peninsula. And the Crimean Peninsula is technically part of Ukraine, but Russia took it over. So Russia took it over because it wanted to use the port of Sevastopol, which they were renting. Why rent when you can own? Now, they took it over, and Ukraine didn't really do anything about it. We didn't do anything about it. So they de facto taken over the place. And by that, I mean Russia. So interesting. I mean, it would be like Canada taking over the state of Maine and Washington saying, oh, well, that sucked. Anyway, they're now part of Canada. So weird. To this day, I'm puzzled as to why nothing ever really happened. But it is what it is. All right, so we're talking about the idea of nuclear connections. And you can't talk about that also without talking about the Olympics in 2014, which talk about the, in Sochi, Russia. And Putin used this as a way of basically re-emerging this region into the world's sort of psyche. It's sort of like a big, giant urban renewal project for which they spent $54 billion, which is pretty impressive. Again, potential development taking place, turning this into an area of tourism that would last long past the Olympics. Putin, again, from the perspective of a Russian, there is a video that I think you would find very, very interesting. And is he a dictator? Maybe, maybe not. It really depends who you ask. He's very popular in Russia, so take that for whatever you think it's worth. He has been in power for quite a while, and chances are he's not coming out of power anytime soon. So he has had difficult dealings with the current president, President Biden, before that President Trump, before that President Obama, who he did not like at all. The feeling was mutual. So, he had issues with President Bush before Obama. That's how long he has been president of Russia. So, interesting geopolitical game going on there. Again, another great video that you can watch, Putin and His Game by the BBC. As far as economic development, well, the area is, the post-Soviet economy meant that you had to basically decentralize a lot of things. Because before that, everything was controlled by the state. Healthcare, agriculture, everything. So that had to change, and it had to change quickly. But there's a couple things that you can actually address, and that's the idea of human development. The higher this number, the better. So the United States, excuse me, as an example, is at 0.92. So the highest here is Russia at 0.8. Gender equality, or inequality, if you want to view it that way, addresses the fact that the lower the number, the more equality there is. or the higher the number, the more inequality there is. So, again, countries like the United States stand at like zero point 0 something, Norway, places like that. If you go to a place like Afghanistan, the gender inequality is high, unfortunately. So, natural resources and industry. So, I'm going to focus on coal and natural gas. This is a big deal. This is ongoing right now. It happens almost every winter, where there's always a fight between Russia and the European Union, namely places like Germany and Poland and so on. So, Russia's a fossil fuel heavy economy, and in an era that's continually moving towards renewables, it's still a big deal. Can't get away from it. So this is the idea of oil and gas. Pipelines that move from Russia into China, into Turkey, into Europe. And the issue here is, think of a place like Germany, a place that has put great emphasis on denuclearizing, on using more wind, more solar, more geothermal, more incineration energy. That's all great. But when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine, what makes up the difference? Especially if you have a cold winter. Right? So now, the problem here is Russia has great power over Germany, in the sense of Russia controls the spigot, that pipeline. They can turn it on and off. And they can create great chaos in places like Europe. So Europe is sort of caught between this, we want to be more energy reliant on ourselves and not have to worry about Russia, but they still have to, because a lot of those resources like sun and wind and water, and they do not meet all their needs. And so that's happening right now. And it seems to happen almost every winter. And if, God forbid, there is an especially cold winter, that could lead to shortages, high prices, economic instability for the region. Here's an example of pipelines going out of Russia into the Ukraine and out into places like Romania, Hungary, Poland, and eventually Germany. So Russia's influence on Europe's natural gas supply is dramatic. In addition to Mongolia and China. And again, China, with being such a big growing economy, needs a lot of energy. China is making a lot of inroads into renewables, but they're so big. I mean, remember, China is over 4 times the size of the United States, people-wise. In terms of social development, gender, culture, politics, healthcare, HIV/AIDS, alcoholism, homophobia, human trafficking, lots and lots of issues to deal with. So here's the idea of Russia and drug abuse and alcohol abuse. So that's also contributing to their higher death rates to some degree, because of the abuse of these stimulants. In terms of women and LGBT community, gender pay disparities, political underrepresentation, the human trafficking sex industry, and this is the one region of the world, well, one of them, where it is the least safe to be part of the LGBT community, where there's still significant persecution going on. So lots of progress to be made. They've made lots of progress since the fall of the Soviet Union, but they have a great deal of distance to go before this improves to any significant degree. So this is where I'll stop. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. Come to the live office hour and or send me an email and we will set something up. Hope you're doing well. I wish you the best of luck and I will talk to you soon. Bye.